businesses, and that went into the books that he and Marx wrote. And the foundational texts of like what scientific socialism that's been used by the working class movement for the past 150 years. So like the social background of who you are is not as important as your ability to look at the concrete experience of workers' struggles, distill what you think is the most important message from that, and then transmit it. And sometimes it's sort of a very very straightforwardly just transmitting news of one worker's struggle to another. I was one of there was a factory occupation on the Isle of Wight recently, a wind turbine factory occupation. And I was one of a small group of socialists who went down when we heard that this factory was going to be shut. And like sort of in the over a period of about a month, we went to the gates of the factory, spoke to workers who were coming on and off shift, and said, don't you think you guys could do something about the fact that you're being booted out of your factory in a very illogical and bad way? And the major thing that we were doing there was transmitting the news of what had happened at the Enfield plant, the Vistey and Enfield plant down the road. And at one point we brought over Ron Clark, who was the union convener at Vistey and Enfield. He came down and gave a speech about what they did, and it was off the back of that workers sort of thought, well, hang on, this works, this other group of workers has had this experience, it appears to work, we're going to go and organise an occupation, and lo, they did. And sometimes it's simply about transmitting news that doesn't make it into the mainstream media. Sometimes it's simply about transmitting the practical experiences of other groups of workers that are very nearby, both geographically and in time. But also, there's a history of 150 years of knowledge that is necessary to process. I think the difficulty comes not with are you working class, are you not? If you're an ally of the working class, then you want to help it, and if you're an organised socialist, you want to help it through developing and distilling the best ideas from this long history of working class struggle. And that's why I think, the idea, I don't think, there are various left groups around today that lay claim to be the revolutionary party. I don't think such a thing currently exists. There's a number of relatively small propaganda circles that exist. But, I think historically the idea of our revolutionary party that tries to develop that best analysis, that's very important. But the philosophical difficulty with that comes from this question of how much can you know? You look at the twists and turns of the 20th century, the development of Soviets in 1905 took the Bolsheviks by surprise. They had absolutely no idea what these things were, and they initially reacted in quite a stupid way to the development of Soviets. They rapidly corrected their mistake. But things happen that with the best training in this history just take you completely by surprise. But nevertheless, that's the epistemological difficulty, trying to distill the best lessons possible and transmit them.
We have one, please.
Hi, yeah. I'd like to comment on the working class issue, but from a slightly different perspective in terms of looking at the issue of the paradigm of that the created, which was discussed earlier, the changing paradigm. And coming from a personal perspective, the closing down of philosophy departments is not new. There was a wave in 2002, and my department at Derby University, which was a joint religious studies philosophy unit, was shut down. And in terms of the question, it does tie in with the working class issue, but it's a question of accessibility. You have a situation in sort of the Midlands where it's a very diverse society. You also have situations of extreme deprivation, and most of our students were minority groups or mature students, and this would be one of the few opportunities where they have a chance to engage with philosophy and with critical study of their own traditions in an academic setting, because they would not have access to that in some of the more mainstream universities. So shutting down a unit like that shuts off certain resources, and it's sort of the withdrawal of critical thinking to certain forums, which are where access is controlled in slightly different ways. And that is perhaps one of the most important things here at Middlesex. It used to be the case that if you were unemployed, etc. You could study here for free as a part-time student. That's changed now, obviously. But the university has had a long commitment to that sort of accessibility, and I think the accessibility to critical thinking. So seeing it in that context moves beyond sort of tokenistic reference to working class, which itself as a concept is now quite problematic, but in very real terms affects people's accessibility to thinking and to engagement with thinking.
Yeah, I also wanted to come in about this issue about being working class and so on. I don't think the problem is being working class these days because of the relentless processes of proletarianisation that are one dimension of neoliberalism. You can, without being too confessional, I think it's probably obvious that I don't spring from a solidly proletarian background. And being an academic, traditionally, while you're a wage earner and all that kind of thing, in all sorts of ways you have been in quite a privileged position. Well, a couple of months ago, I, like all these staff in the Arts and Humanities School at King's, got a notice saying that our jobs were at risk of redundancy and we were going to have to reapply for our jobs. And that brought home, not just to me, but to colleagues who'd had some illusions that academics were different, that we were indeed proletarians with a kind of insecurity condition like other proletarians. And of course what's happened here reinforces that in a very kind of stark way. In other words, the problem isn't whether or not one's working class or not, because neoliberalism involves an enormous extension of proletarianisation. I mean, apart from anything else, students are part of the precarious workforce of part-time, low-paid, generally unorganised workers that neoliberal capitalism relies on. The person who referred to security guards, absolutely right. They're often in an extremely contradictory position, that they're to kind of to police the security of private property, but at the same time often migrant workers, probably illegal migrant workers, in an extremely vulnerable and oppressed position. The big problem is to do with all these people who are objectively proletarians conceiving themselves and acting as a working class subject, because the kind of defeats that was talking about involved the kind of ruin, the destruction of a particular kind of working class subjectivity, which isn't completely dead. I mean, part of the significance of the election result is that Labour, relative to what was being predicted, did quite well, or didn't do as disastrously as was being predicted, and I think that reflects the kind of grip that even a decadent and declining Labourism has on quite large sections of those who aren't just objectively working class, but conceive themselves as working class. But nevertheless, that's a declining and disintegrating working class subjectivity. And for me, the challenge is how to construct a different kind of working class subjectivity. And again, I mean, in a way, this fits in with what Peter was saying. It's not a planned process. At King's now, we've been on strike twice in the past month. In the past, that would be inconceivable, going on strike at all, let alone twice against our own management, not just part of some sort of national pay dispute. In other words, in a small way, that's a particular group of workers reconceiving themselves and beginning to operate in a different way. The challenge is to do that on a much larger scale, because what the experience of being proletarian means for most people is a combination of tremendous oppression at work and then absorption in the society of the spectacle with all the fragmenting effects it has. It's not an experience of any kind of collective subjectivity that has a liberated dynamic, and that's really the